now your host, Chicago Reader columnist, Ben Joravsky.
About 2 weeks ago, I was at the Personal Pack Luncheon. We talked about that a lot in the show, and sitting right next to me, or nearby me, was Kina Collins. She said, Ben, I want to come back in your show. I said, come on back, Kina Collins. So here you are. Welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on again. It's always great to be here.
And as we said earlier, Kina Collins is a candidate for Congress in the 7th Congressional District. The incumbent is Danny Davis. He's been the incumbent there since, I want to say...
22 years.
Wow. Okay. Thank you. 22 years. 22 years? You sure about that? Yeah,
22
you would
years
know.
because he was a city alderman, then he became a commissioner, and then he became a congressperson.
All right.
So he was just in the political scene for a long time.
He was in political. So you got an update for me on
Yeah, before we get going here, just some quick updates. First off, we got people weighing in on the YouTube live stream. Boy, Doug Doggerson is his name, and he's never weighed in before, and I'm glad he is. Doug Doggerson says, boy, I never thought I'd find myself listening to a Gilmore Girls podcast.
Sorry, dog. By the way, his nickname? Double D.
Double D. Doug Doggerson. Coming up a little later, everybody, some Gilmore Girls trivia. Do not worry, but we do have actual news to talk about here. This is some national news here. A 2020 presidential candidate update. Candidate Elizabeth Warren. She's had a hell of a week here. She has raised, this is the news here, she's raised over $24.6 million over the past 3 months, relying largely on a massive small donor operation to solidify her status as a leading contender for the 2020 presidential nomination. The Massachusetts Senator Hall announced on Friday is just less than $25.3 million. Her chief liberal rival, Mr. $27 himself, the one and only Bernie Sanders, Vermont, he posted during the third quarter. So there you are, $24.6 million raised by Liz Warren.
Liz Warren, she's on. You know what, Kina, from the last time in the show, I just honestly cannot remember. Are you supporting Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, or are you not supporting anybody in this race?
I still think it's very early, but my top two are Elizabeth Warren and Bernie.
That's what my memory was.
Yeah.
And you have to, and of course, Bernie had the operation on Tuesday.
Yes.
Apparently, he's doing fine. He says, anyway, so we were talking about you're running in the 7th Congressional. Danny Davis has been the incumbent since 1997. Is that right? And this traditionally was a West Side district, and this is something that you want to talk about, how the district has changed, let's say, since way back when in the 60s and the 70s, and in the 80s and the 90s. There was an article that appeared, I can't remember where it appeared, but it talked about the advantages that some of the candidates may have due to racial identity. And you said, Ben, I have to talk about this, so feel free, go ahead.
Yeah, so the article was a political article, and essentially the argument that was being made was that, well, the wording was wrong in my opinion, because it said West Loop and the Loop have transformed the Illinois 7th Congressional District. Even though we know that this is a majority minority district, it's 70% nearly of people of color, 54% of that are Black folks from the West Side and South Side, which flank the district and are broad swaths of the district. And unfortunately, in the article, when the South Side and West Side was referenced, it was very dog whistle and coded language. The next words that came after that were high crime rates. And that was all that was mentioned about it. But what we do know for a fact is that the incumbent has been able to keep a stronghold on this seat because it is a predominantly Black district, in the same way that Bobby Rush has been able to keep a stronghold on his seat in Illinois 1. And so, for me, I think that given the political atmosphere that we're in right now, we have to be very careful about that coded language, because in my opinion, you don't get to a Donald Trump by the white supremacists and the blatant racism that has gone on in this country. We get there by the subtle nuances. And we are just suffering from an identity crisis in the Democratic Party, period. And I think that when you have strong, young, progressive, African-American candidates who are running in Black districts, that we need to be careful with the words that we use around that. I felt like it was an erasure of the working class communities in that district. And it's also the culture, and I think you touched on this brilliantly in the last segment, of corporate Chicago, that we don't have to deal with those people. district could change if we would only just like get rid of those sides of the city. Well, you can't get rid of those sides of the city, right? You can try, and we have seen a political and strategic effort to push people out of these communities. So our campaign is striking back and fighting back on that narrative. And I think it's just a complete lack of understanding of the district when you use language like that. I don't think any candidate who uses language of we have to ignore the west side or south side, or that the only transformation happening in the district is the loop, they're going to be sadly mistaken on March 17th, because that is the way that we win this seat against an incumbent is that you have to go deep, deep, deep into these neighborhoods that are working class neighborhoods, black neighborhoods, brown neighborhoods, and you got to crush all the doors in order to do that. And so it was just very tone deaf. I didn't like the coded language of erasure of these communities, and we're pushing back on that narrative.
Mm-hmm. By the way, I feel compelled at this point to mention that Anthony Clark was also running the race. He's been on the show many times. I'm sure I'll invite him back as well. Kina, going back to something you said, I took notes on it. Identity crisis in the Democratic Party. Yeah. What did you mean by that?
I think that why did it take, we'll talk obviously more about this, but why does it take so long for us to impeach or call for an impeachment of this president? Right? This idea, I reject the notion that it's working class white voters versus everybody else. I reject the notion that we can't work on workers' rights and criminal justice reform at the same time. And I think that we're pawning this hurt off on one constituency at the time, and we don't have a cohesive message of what that is. And I think it's a generational battle that's happening in the Democratic Party, where you see a clamoring and a sense of urgency coming from folks who we could be expanding the electorate with, immigrant rights groups, women's rights groups, workers' rights. When the labor unions stopped voting for the Democratic Party, the way I feel about what's happening nationally is that all of the pushback that we're seeing from even the freshman Congress people who have come in and established Democratic leadership shows the lack of direction of who we are as a party. But the truth of who we are is that we are a party that fights for workers' rights and women's rights and social justice. We are the party that will tackle and have the difficult conversations about race, right? And not back down from that. And all of this middle of the road, moderate, very critical and urgent issues that are happening in our country right now is setting us back. We have to build the base in 2020 in order to take this administration out, because the Republicans know who they are. They know who they are, and even if they don't agree with it, they're going with it, right? Because they want to win. And so it's time for the Democratic Party to be held accountable and to elevate new leadership. And that was one of the impetus for my run.
Well, one of the, when you said generational battle, I had a smile because so many of the millennials I know, and this goes back to 2016 as well, the candidate they gravitated towards was the oldest guy in the race. And in this show, a lot of people come in, they make fun of old white guys. And they're evidently making fun of Bullable but it's ironic that the old white guy in the race, Bernie Sanders, is like in many cases the freshest voice, talking about issues that really matter to people, really resonate with people. These are age-old values that should be at the cornerstone of the Democratic Party. Why they're not, it's a whole other story. But it is interesting. I got to give your generation credit for one thing, just one thing, no, more than one thing.
The only thing.
You're not closed-minded about age. I follow just. You know what I'm saying?
So,
like so many young people embrace Bernie.
Let's unpack that. Let's park there and unpack that. I think historically young people, this is not a millennial thing. These issues that we're fighting for are intergenerational fights, right? I think that what we're seeing now from my generation is that there are deadlines on climate change. We cannot wait 20 years to figure out climate change. We have 11 years. There are things like gun violence that we cannot wait on. It's an urgent crisis. But if you look historically, young people have been the fuel, whether it was in the 60s, during the civil rights movements, second wave of feminism, whatever, what have you, young people have fueled it. I think what made Bernie stand out in that last primary was look at the comparison of what we had as options. We had Hillary Clinton, who had been deeply rooted and already established and grandfathered into the Democratic Party. And Bernie had already been a legislator too, but he was not a part of that vein of corporate Democrats, right? He had been consistent on a lot of these arguments that he was making, and he took an intersectional approach on how we need to be talking about climate change and environmental racism, right? Like it's not, you can't talk about one without the other. And so in the same way, I would flip it and say the same way that Donald Trump activated a group of people who felt disenfranchised in this country and felt like their voices were not being heard, Bernie was activating his grassroots movement as well. So I don't know if it's just, I would say across the board in history, young people have been the rhythm and the heartbeat of any movement that gets passed in this country.
Mm-hmm. Well, in Bernie's case, I would say he's articulating the same values that he had when he was a young person back in the late 50s, early 60s. He was at the University of Chicago taking part in protests against racial segregation. In many ways, he's still articulating, expressing those same values.
Been extremely consistent. And that's why it's hard, for me to, because Elizabeth Warren, has been consistent since she's been in Congress as well and has passed some things that people may argue, like her pass of, being a Republican and, all of that history that comes along with that. I've been critical of Bernie as well, though. I think that as a Black woman currently living in America, he went to She the People Forum, and I wanted to hear more from his campaign, right? Like, how do we save Black mothers who are 3 to 4 times more likely to die during childbirth? And he didn't have a very specific response to that. Those are real life issues that we're looking at. It goes into the conversation of Medicare for all, right? Like, we have to broaden this conversation. And that's why I say that the Democratic Party has this identity crisis, because, who are we? Who are we fighting for? And how do we plan to transform through big ideas this country? And the crazy part about it is that the momentum is there. The groundswell is there. So it's just like, I'm like pulling my hair out like, Dems, get it together, because it's there. You can definitely feel it.
Dems, get it together, man. I've been saying that for like 50 years, way before you were born. I know the feeling. All right, now there's a couple points that you made that I want to come back to and address. One of them has to do with an article that a friend of mine, Benji, if you're listening, shout out to Benji, sent this to me. It had to do with the fact that a significant number of Black voters in this country, Black Democrats, are with Biden. And there was a deep dive taken that Black voters tend to go with the establishment candidate, quote unquote. So, like, for instance, many Black voters went with Hillary in 2016, and many Black voters right now, at least in the polls, are with Joe Biden. Your thoughts on that? Do you think it's an exaggeration? Do you think it's a generational? What are some of the issues there? So
I think it's both. I think it's an exaggeration. And one of the frustrations also is that the consultants that are in the Democratic Party, I'm sorry, they're garbage in the establishment Democratic Party. And they keep using these polls as a way to justify a lot of what they believe is the front runner or leader, right? And that was our fatal mistake in 2016. That was a fatal mistake, because they were not polling an electorate of people who had never voted before. So there were places where Donald Trump expanded the electorate in some places. And I think on the flip side, you could talk about AOC. She expanded the electorate in certain places in her district. Ayanna Pressley, she's in Massachusetts 7. She expanded her electorate by 400% in some places. So the polls that were going out were inaccurate because they were polling people who were part of one pool of voters, but they didn't account for all the people who had never voted before, or people who had skipped out on other primaries and were now changing their stances on things. So that's one thing. I think that we have to not lean all the way on those polls. The second thing is, it is generational. Younger Black voters are not for Joe Biden. He does not represent what we see or how we want to see the country moving forward, especially not when you were the architect of the 94 crime bill. You will not get my vote. He is not the candidate that I want. Now, I know that we get to a place where whoever the Democratic nominee is, we have to think long and hard and be smart just about who we're voting for. But if we're in a primary and we have strong progressives like Sanders, like Warren, I think that they've been showing through both their small dollar donors, their crowd sizes, the policy platforms that they're putting forth, the coalitions that they're building. They are sitting in a place of coalition and movement building. And Joe Biden is sitting in an ancient, antiquated place where I think it will come out, and we will be very shocked when the primaries happen.
There was to this point, there was an article in the paper I saw the other day talking about older black voters, how they're being influenced by their children. I read the article. The children are saying, "No, don't vote for Biden for X, Y, Z." Just what you said. It's your generation talking to my generation. And I just thought back to the conversations I heard so many white people on this in 2016. So follow me on this one, Kina.
Okay.
So my daughter's generation, your generation, would have a conversation. White kids would have a conversation with their parents. Don't vote for Hillary. And because, she's Bernie's got the best programs. Bernie's talking about issues that are important to me. And the geezer generation of white people, I could say it because I am of that generation, would respond by saying, well, you don't understand. You don't understand. There's no way this country's ever going to elect Bernie Sanders. You got to be practical. You got to be pragmatic. They're not going to vote for a Bernie Sanders. They're only going to vote for Hillary. So older white people, their attitude was, these kids don't know what they're talking about. I'm doubling down on Hillary Clinton. In your humble opinion, do older black people have that same attitude?
So I'm of a special demographic of voter, right? Black women. We are the most engaged voting bloc in the country. And what I will say is that politics in itself in Black households, particularly amongst Black women, is a kitchen table conversation. I remember when I had my first opportunity to vote, my mom was in the kitchen and she was like cooking, and she's like, you have your ID ready for tomorrow because we're going to vote. Like, it's just like a ritual. I don't think that Black women are so stubborn that they're gonna move, like they won't be moved to another a more progressive candidate. And Elizabeth Warren has been making those strides in a lot of those areas. So I don't necessarily, I think it's which demographic you're speaking to. I have found that, and this is just me anecdotally speaking, older Black men do typically stay with their candidate, who they want. That's an established candidate that, they know. I think Black women are swayed by policy and implementation. And if you're giving the best policy and implementation, they are more moved to vote for that candidate. So it is going to be interesting to see the exit polling of how all of this happens. But it is generational. And I think Joe Biden having that association with President Obama is reminiscent for a lot of people and nostalgic for a lot of people. But I think that with having Trump in the presidency, a lot more is at stake, and people are noticing that more and more. We saw it in primary elections like Stacey Abrams and Andrew Gillum running against, or Doug Jones running against Roy Moore, right? Where those were establishment people that they were running against. And in the case of Doug Jones, he won. Stacey Abrams and Andrew Gillum it wasn't the turnout that we wanted. So I think it's movable, but I hope that voters are going to be far more informed going to the polls this time.
Well, there's this notion, and this is something else following up, and you said there's a notion on the part of many strategists in the Democratic Party that if we push too hard on the values and issues that, let's say, Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren are championing openly, we're going to alienate and turn off swing voters. So don't push too hard on that. In fact, Rahm Emanuel, the advice he gave was during the last debate.
He gives horrible advice. That's why he's not in office right now. So listening to him taking his own advice.
Yeah. Don't go too hard. You're going to turn off the little ones.
Well,
Take a chill pill, man.
Oh, sorry.
Well, my background is in being a coalition built around single payer Medicare for all. And so many people make the argument that the Medicare for all is just too to the left and people won't buy into that. Well, actually, it polls really well amongst Democratic voters and amongst people in the country. And that's why you see Democratic candidates say Medicare for some. Medicare for America. They'll make it a different variation of Medicare for all because they know that it polls really well. I don't think it's too extreme to say housing is a human right, healthcare is a human right. We are $1.5 trillion stuck in student loan debt. We should make public colleges free for students. That we should be implementing police accountability across this country, right? Those things are not extreme stances. I think that that's just a play out of the GOP handbook that unfortunately moderate Democrats have taken on, and it's infected our party, in my opinion.
You're definitely against you are definitely we're going in a different direction from the conventional wisdom. Everything you just say, I agree with you on that one, but you're definitely going against conventional wisdom. Let's break it. Come a little get a local issue here. So many Chicago congressmen, again, Kina is running for the Democratic primary for the 7th Congressional District against an incumbent, Danny K. Davis. But so many congressmen in Chicago look the other way at local issues. So we're in the precipice of a teacher strike. I hope they cut a deal, but it looks as though there's going to be a strike. And the traditional Democratic congressional attitude is look the other way. I've had so many conversations. Our next two guests know this. They're historians of Chicago politics. I've had so many conversations with Chicago Democrats about the role of a congressperson or a congressman or congresswoman in Chicago. Should they be a citizen of Chicago, or do they let go of Chicago when they go to Washington, just talk about national issues, either look the other way on local issues, or just join whatever the establishment is? So in 2012, I can't recall any Chicago congressman, and I'm looking at Jacob and Danny, they know. I can't recall any Chicago congressman who stood with the teachers in 2012. I don't recall any who actually stood with the I know Jesse Jackson stood with the teachers. I know Nick Spazzato stood with the teachers.
I don't know any right now. That's
I don't know. Yeah. So
who is it right now?
You're running for office. Are you gonna just stay out of it? Go, well, it's not my issue, or what's your position about the pending teacher strike?
So this is extremely important, right? Because when we talk about me running for federal office, it's you going to legislate on comprehensive issues across this country. And when we talk about the public education system, there's so many layers of when we talk about crime, when we talk about environmental justice, once again, and when we talk about the success of our students and how we're preparing them, you have to take a stand. So in full transparency, my mother is a member of SEIU Local 73.
Oh, I did not know that.
My father is a 30-year dues-paying member of Teamster Local 743. I come from a union household. On top of that, I am the only insurgent candidate, or pretty much the only candidate that's running in this Illinois 7th race who graduated from a CPS school. So I can speak to these issues, and I can't stand on the sidelines about this. 16,000 of CPS students are homeless right now. I think Chicago Teachers Union taking the stance of we want smaller class sizes, we need fair contracts, we have to take a decarceral approach of the prison to school to prison pipeline, take the resource officers out, give us school counselors, give us librarians, give us social workers. Why are we having this discussion, and why are we gridlocked, right? And so what I will say is that Lori Lightfoot has inherited a mess from Rahm Emanuel. That's what I will say as well. Nevertheless, a solution has to happen because we can't continue to have another decade of what has happened in the city of Chicago around the Chicago public school system. Out of the 50 schools that were shut down, which was the largest public school shutdown in American history in Chicago, 28 of them were in the district that I'm running in. And they were Black and brown communities. Right. And so and they were Black and brown namesake schools like Emmett Till. So this is important because now we don't just have abandoned buildings and vacant lots. We have abandoned schools sitting in our neighborhoods. And this is the city budget is the moral compass any budget is the moral compass of a country or a city. And we know that there has been a divestment in education and an investment in policing in the city, particularly in the communities that have been hardest hit. So I have sat with members of CTU. A good chunk of my district are teachers. So they are coming to us with their concerns. And this is not just a fight for Chicago public school students. This is about the battle of corporate interests in our country, of charter schools coming and swallowing up the public school education system across this country. This is for all the kids in Louisiana and Mississippi who have lived below the poverty line and have the worst educational ranking in the country. It's for the fact that our students are going off to college in this country and are remedial in reading levels and math levels. This is the battle of the soul of our country. And so I've been proud to see how the unions have stood tall with each other. And like I said, unfortunately, Lori Lightfoot inherited a mess when she stepped into office. And I hope that they come to a solution. But I could see why these teachers are not backing down.
If they don't come to a solution, would you be one of those candidates who gets on the picket line with the teachers?
I have to. I come from a union household. I have to. I'm a CPS student. I have to. I live in the Austin community. I've seen what has happened when CPD officers have went into Marshall High School and tased a 16-year-old student, right? This is, we are not taking the necessary steps. We are being regressive in a lot of our approaches. And so I have to take a stand on this situation. And I know that the community feels the same way. These teachers obviously don't want all of these students out in the streets because they'll be striking. They're doing this because they love their students. And so I think that we need to be having very innovative conversations about how we eliminate a lot of these problems. But fighting for class size, should not be the fight that we're having in 2019.
She is Kina Collins. She's running for Congress in the 7th Congressional District. Kina, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Ben.
All right, and the political know-it-alls are on deck. We're going to bring them on after this. Hey, everybody, what's your